Hello everyone, it's Retroaction. Welcome back to another Star Wars The Power of the Force 2 review. This is the Han Solo and Stormtrooper Disguise, which was a Fruit Loops Kellogg's promotion railway figure released by Kenner in 1995. So, yep, this was a railway figure with Fruit Loops from Kellogg's and Kenner. So this was, of course, a partnership between Kellogg's and Kenner to release a railway figure of Han Solo and Stormtrooper Disguise, which was never available in the vintage line. So this is a first for Kenner. It's quite cool. It has a removable helmet, and it's in this obviously very Kenner, very 1990s Kenner battle stance, action stance even. Yep, it's quite cool. Now I'll go into detail about why the hands are supposed to hold a blaster later, because as you can see they were intended to. Because yep, as you can see, infamously his hands were sculpted to hold a blaster, but he didn't come with one, which we'll get to in a bit. Detail's quite good on this figure. It's quite cool. This guy was actually the very first. This was actually the very first Star Wars Power Force 2 figure ever revealed by Kenner, so that's quite cool. It kicked off the modern Star Wars line, but it wasn't released until this was actually released between Wave 1 and Wave 2 of the Power Force 2. So, and you see we got Kenner China there, and 1995 LFL. Not much going on in the back there, but as you can see, it's a good figure. I quite like the Power Force 2 Stormtrooper design. Of course, they're in this battle action stance, and let's get a close up on his helmet. It's a good looking helmet. Yeah, looks good. The articulation, well, you've got one joint in the arms, one joint in the legs, and you've got a swivel at the waist, and also the head will turn. So that's quite good. Of course, his arms can't do much, because much like all the other, there are a lot of Power Force 2 figures that do this, actually. Well, one example being the Complete Galaxy Death Star. The Darth Vader that came with that had the arms sculpted in one position, and as you can see, these arms are permanently bent in this position. So that's interesting. The helmet looks good. Of course, it is removable, so we're going to take it off now. And there we have Han Solo. It's a good head sculpt. Head will turn, with and without the helmet, obviously. Yep. Zoom in on that. That's a good head sculpt. Looks good. Some nice detail on this figure. Yeah, it stands well, even though it's in that stance. Yeah, so even if you can pose it, and it will stand. So that's quite good. I'll spread the legs out a bit, and it will stand up. Yep. So that's quite good. Fair bit of posability you can have from this guy. Well, it's just not very posable because there's no second joint in the legs. They don't bend at the knee or anything. So it's very much like the vintage kind of figures. But it's now got this action stance and this 90s look. So yep, that is the figure. Looks good. Now, as for that blaster, this figure was intended to actually have a blaster, but due to Kellogg's policy of no weapons, Kenner had to find another way to release this blaster. And so, even though he was actually sculpted to, even though as you can see his arms were sculpted to hold a blaster, he never actually came with one, which is interesting. The story of that concludes because with this figure, because Kenner took 3 years to find a way to release this blaster, and it finally turned up with this freeze frame figure, which is the powerful. As you can see, we've got the Kenner Collection branding and everything, so it's a later figure. That was the Princess Leia Organa, the new likeness, because of the original one was not a very good figure at all, because they wanted to go for that He-Man design, the Masters Universe style figures. So yep, that is the figure that this blaster finally came up, where it was released with. The blaster, that was the figure that the blaster intended for this guy was released with. It was a double gripped blaster, and it's the one she's actually holding in the card on the card there. So he is actually sculpted to hold a blaster. He can actually hold any blaster quite successfully, but he never came with one due to Kellogg's policy of no weapons in their promotions. And because of that, Kenner had to find another way to release the blaster for this figure. So that is why his hands are intended to hold a blaster. It's an interesting story, and it's a good job that Kenner released the figure. I mean, the blaster intended, because they didn't have to. But that's good that they kind of made up for it with that. With that Princess Leia figure, they kind of made up for the fact this guy didn't come with a blaster originally. which is nice that Kenner did that, because it's not often companies do things like that. So that was good on their part. As you can see, you can hold the Imperial Blaster quite successfully there. Looks great, actually, with it. Definitely intended for him to hold a blaster, of course. Yeah, it looks brilliant. But he's not actually meant to have this Imperial Blaster, which is the interesting part. He actually came with his own double grips blaster. So you can see this guy doesn't have a double grip. This is actually from the TIE Fighter pilot, which I got with my Stormtrooper from In Demand Toys. He doesn't actually have his second gun. He's got like this giant, large cannon or something that he's got a secondary gun he comes with. So I'm not going to do a review on this guy. As you can see, there he is. There's the TIE Fighter pilot. I really like his head sculpt. It's a nice update from the Kenner figure, from the vintage figure, because this guy's from Kenner as well. Yep, so that is it for the Power Force 2 Han Solo Stormtrooper Disguise. Even though it didn't come with a blaster, it's still a cool figure nonetheless, and definitely would recommend getting that blaster for him, which is probably what I'm going to try and do. Yeah, so I haven't actually seen any pictures of how he looks, that blaster. He probably looks quite cool. Oh yeah, of course, Hasbro has re-released this figure plenty of times now. I mean, they've released, not that, I don't think they have re-released this figure, but they've made modern versions, newer versions of Han Solo and Stormtrooper Disguise. But at the time, this was the first time he was ever offered in the Kenner line. He was never offered in the vintage line. So, him being first in the Power Force 2 line was quite a big deal at the time. And hence why it's a mail away that was quite successful, even though it didn't come with a blaster. So, and it's one of two railway figures, the other being the Ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi, which was also in 1995. And later you get the Bremar Monk and other stuff, which is another Power Force 2 first, just like this guy. Another first for Ken, even. So, he had his debut in the Power Force 2 line, Han Solo in Stormtrooper Disguise, and he's still quite a popular figure today. Of course, now they have greater articulation in this version, but it's still a good figure. Definitely worth picking up. It's quite cool. And if you can find the blaster it's meant to come with, which was packed in with that freeze-frame hand Princess Leia, go for it. It looks great. And it probably worked really well. It's a great figure as it is, and having that blaster would just complete it, even though it didn't come with it originally. Of course, it was intended for him, so in that sense, you could probably get away with having the blaster in his hand. Because that's the figure it was really intended for, not that Princess Leia. So, because he was intended to hold that blaster, I'm definitely going to track that down. And, of course, Power Force 2 is... Well, it shouldn't be too difficult to find, this figure. Yeah, I'll have to see as time goes by. But, yeah, that is it for the Power Force 2 Han Solo and Stormtrooper Disguise. A great figure from Kenner. Yeah, with an interesting backstory about the blaster. And that is the first mail-away promotion. Very cool. Anyway, this is Retroaction. Thank you very much for watching. See you all next time. Goodbye for now.